Hello, beloved. I am Pastor VictorResendiz. Welcome to this weekly series called God is Love, conversations on compassion, justice, and spirituality. Each week, we will explore our role as Christian believers in today's national dialogue around race and racism. We'll be joined by Liz Peterson, Assistant Director of Houston Coalition Against Hate, a network of organizations, institutions, and individuals committed to preventing and addressing all forms of hate in our community. We invite you to listen for the transforming Word of God, as together we seek to fully embody the great commandment to love God and love neighbor. Hello, everyone. We are back in our second round of the God is Love series. This is our second conversation. I hope that you joined us in our first conversation. And if you didn't get a chance to listen to us last week, just know that it's still recorded in our Memorial Drive UMC YouTube channel, and it's also on our Facebook page, so you can always go back and revisit that conversation. Welcome back, Liz. Good to see you again.
Thank you. See you too.
Hope you're not getting tired of me.
No, never. I enjoy our conversations.
Yes, I do too. Well, today we have another topic that is going to help us reflect and invite us to just not only knowledge, but also where God wants to take us with this particular topic. So I'm going to let you get us started with allyship. And thank you for teaching me how to pronounce that.
Yes, thank you. Let me share my screen if you'd give me permission.
Give me a second. Yes, it's done now. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
You should be able to. There you go.
All right, let's get into the slideshow. Oops, that's not what I meant. Give me just a second. There we go. So I wanted to talk about allyship today because it's a question I hear a lot from people who are listening or people who are interested in learning more about what to do about the racism that they're learning about and how to move differently in the world. They know maybe they should move differently and they don't know what that really looks like. So that's what we're going to explore today. So I wanted to start with a really beautiful quote that I found from Christine Walters Paintner's Lectio Divina, the Sacred Art, Transforming Words and Images into Heart-Centered Prayer. And she says, being compassionate means to enter into the deep, wounded heart of the world and to birth a relationship of mutuality with the poor, the sick, the imprisoned, the homeless, the dying, the exploited, the oppressed, and all with whom God identifies. And I found that to be really moving, especially because it calls us into what you see, the relationship of mutuality. So that means that we are in mutual solidarity. We are not in power over, we are not feeling sorry for, we are what Jesus called us to do. What Jesus did is align directly with the poor, the sick, the imprisoned, the homeless. And another thing that I call you to notice about this quote is that the people that we're called to relationship of mutuality with are people who are not like us and people who do not have the same experience as us and people who may have done things we don't like or we don't understand or we don't condone. If we only do for the worthy people, the people that we see worthy, we are not being an ally. That's something that's very crucial. We need to set aside our judgment and go with whom God identifies, which is these people, the poor, the sick, the imprisoned, the homeless, the dying, the exploited, and the oppressed. So what is an ally? And I found a good acronym that I will explore with you today that I think really helps us unpack some, not all. This is not going to be like, well, I took this little hour-long lecture and now I'm a completely perfect ally, because that does not exist. And I'll talk again later about why it's somewhat problematic for us to identify ourselves as an ally. because that's only something we can aspire to be, not something we can declare for ourselves. Like, I aspire to be a good listener, but the people in my life whom share their concerns and joys with me, they're the ones that will tell you if I'm actually a good listener, even if I'm aspiring to do that. Mm-hmm. So an ally is someone who always centers the impacted, who's willing to listen and learn from the oppressed, who can leverage their privilege, and who's willing to yield the floor. So let's look at each one of those a little more deeply. So always center the impacted. What does this mean? We as white people are kind of used to being at the center of any conversation, meeting, gathering, anything that's being considered. We're used to being catered to. What is our preference? What are we used to? Like, how do meetings get conducted? How do we like to be addressed? How do we think things should be run to make the changes we want to see? And what we have to learn to do, and it's always a practice, is how to decenter ourselves and center the people who are impacted by oppression. So how are some ways that this shows up? Well, this is a text from Rosanna Arquette. I'm sorry I was born white and privileged. It disgusts me and I feel so much shame. So the reason that I share this is not to shame her, but to point out how many times she says the word I. So if you're saying the word I a bunch of times in what you're posting on social media or what you're sharing with someone, and honestly, God forbid, a person of color, I is not the vantage point that you're supposed to be coming from. If you want to talk to me, if you want to come to a meeting like Surge or of other white allies and accomplices, by all means, we can talk within ourselves about our feelings of guilt and shame, which are totally natural. But if you are presenting outward to the world or to people of color in particular, if you center I, all you're thinking about is you, how much shame you feel, and not what we need to focus on is what has been done, what is being done to the people of color. So this leads me to the next thing, which is tears. And I cry out of embarrassment, I cry out of anger, and I understand that is a natural phenomenon you can't necessarily control. And so I invite you to do what I've done and step out of the room. If you are in a room where racism is being discussed and you feel like you're losing control of your emotions, then it's time for you to take care of yourself and take a break and step out, because I think we've all seen and maybe even been the person who kind of takes over the energy of the room by crying so profusely that you see particularly the Black women kind of forced into a role of comforting the white person, often woman, who's crying. And so again, I'm not saying that this happening makes you bad or wrong, but I am saying, I'm inviting you to see how that puts you back at the center of the conversation when we should be centering those impacted by oppression. So another thing that we do is tone police. We tell people, I would listen to you if you weren't shouting at me. I don't like the way that you're talking to me. You know, we can have a reasonable conversation. These are all things that you might really be thinking, but think about the times when you have been very angry about some injustice that you perceive to have been done to you, and how you feel about expressing that. And then kind of think about how it must feel if your life has been impacted greatly all the time by centuries of oppression systematically. And that's why people are angry. And often also it's a cultural thing, because different cultures express themselves in different ways. And so some cultures can speak in a louder tone and in a more straightforward tone that to a polite, non-confrontational white person might feel like anger, and to them it's just fact, you know. And so we have to when you get on about the tone, and you're centering your feelings in the conversation, not the person of color. We also say not all white people. Of course, not all white people. Everyone knows not all white people. Not all the time. But when we say not all white people, again, you're centering your feelings. And the last thing I wanted to say is the practice of taking selfies when we go to protest marches or when we go to volunteer somewhere, whether it's domestically in our own neighborhoods or cities, or when we go on a mission trip and we take pictures with all the adorable little children that we're serving. Like the act of taking a selfie, or if you're not a selfie generation person, but you're having someone take a picture of you, is explicitly centering you. Your attendance in the protest does not necessarily need to be broadcast. There is room for discussion about when checking into a protest or when sharing that you went to a protest. But if I were going to take pictures at protests, what I do is take pictures of the speakers and quote the speakers, so that what I'm doing is centering their voice and not my own.
Correct. Wow.
So the first L was listen and learn from the oppressed. And I love this quote from the Dalai Lama: when you talk, you are only repeating what you already know. But if you listen, you may learn something new. And it's just, we always tend to listen to respond. We listen for the pause in the conversation when it's our turn to talk. And if we can begin to practice deep listening, we can finally have the opportunity that we say we want to hear what it's like to be a Black person or a person of color. And when we're thinking of sometimes it's polite when you're in a conversation to compare a situation that you've been in to show solidarity with that person. Like, you have a toothache. Well, I've had a toothache too. And you know that can get kind of like a one-upsmanship, and that can get very uncomfortable, even in a conversation that's just among friends, people who've known each other for a long time. So when you're trying to express your solidarity by your total understanding of where this person is coming from, you're not really listening and learning from them. You're parroting what you already know, and you're missing out on the opportunity to hear with fresh ears and to change your perspective. So the next L is leverage your privilege. And this is hard. There's no like guide, like this is appropriate allyship. This is what we would call white saviorism. This is sometimes we talk about like the woke Olympics, like out proving to each other which one of us knows more about racism. But there are ways that we can do it, and we must do it to leverage our privilege. And we can do it, we just have to take the chance and learn from our mistakes when we've gone too far, when someone gives us the honor of correcting us. So one thing we need to do is have conversations with other white people about white privilege, race, and racism. This is the number one thing that you can do right now to change the situation of systemic racism in the country, because the more people that you talk to that are in your circle of influence who will listen to you, that is transformative. And just think, if those people just live their life a little bit differently, the combined impact of all of those little bit different changes would be dramatic. So the other thing that we need to do is to amplify the voices of people of color talking about race, racism, and white privilege on social media. And this is something that I had to learn. You know, I am tempted to say, I can't believe George Floyd was murdered in that way. It is so sad and distressing to me to know in this day and age, and notice all the I's and the me's, when there are multitudes of Black people making impressive, more deep, more beautiful, more heart-wrenching, more everything commentary on anything going on around race than I could ever dream of. And so I am always sharing, not, I do very little commentary myself.
Sure.
Another thing is being assertive about challenging racism in your community or workplace. And I know that this gets to be, I'm going to go to the next, be an observant bystander, because my workplace, Houston Coalition Against Hate, is going to be running bystander intervention training in 2021. And one of the reasons that people don't intervene when they see instances of identity-based hatred or bigotry going on is because they don't want to be perceived as a white savior. But something around the order of 80% of people who said they had been the victim of or been the target of identity-based harassment or violence said they wished someone had intervened, and only 20-some% said someone really did intervene.
Right, correct.
So, so standing up is a crucial way. You will always be safer by virtue of your white skin than somebody who has Black or brown skin or is another person of color. And then support businesses owned by people of color. There are lots of Black restaurants, Black bookstores. Online, you can order anything from candles and soap to the forehead thermometers, touchless thermometers, masks. You can order all sorts of things from people of color, and we make a choice every day in how we spend our dollars.
Right.
We also make a choice in what service providers we use. So doctors, dentists, accountants, lawyers, make choices to support and then refer people of color. Fight for voting rights. This is not a talk about voting rights in particular, but regardless of your political stance, historically, people of color and Black people have been denied the right to vote either explicitly, as in the 60s, or through various intimidation tactics, or through laws that disproportionately affect oppressed people, intentionally so. And so one thing we can do right now is volunteer to be somebody who stands at the polls and makes sure everyone is safe voting. You're not advocating for any politician or political party. You're simply there to observe. The Texas Civil Rights Project is running one of these. You can also just Google vote defenders and find the ability to do this. They're all very aware of COVID and our concerns around that. And so there's ways to do it from your vehicle or from a distance, depending on your health status. But these are ways that you can make a difference right now. And get involved with organizations doing anti-racism work. That might not mean getting involved in person, that might mean donating, because our money is invaluable to the work that a lot of these Black people and people of color are doing for free. And we can keep them with their lights on and eating by supporting their anti-racism work. So the last letter Y is yield the floor, and I chose this image because I liked how the white, at least the palest white-skinned fist was in the background. And it's so tempting for us to be in charge and to step into a situation and to think, I know how to fix this. I know how to get the city council to listen to me, or I know how to run a business, or I know how to write a press release. And this is not helpful. A lot of times what we're actually doing is, trying to push a method that they already knew about and that had already failed for a myriad reasons. They know what's going on in their communities. They know what we need, and what they need is support and backup. And so it's not glamorous, and it's not, powerful the way we're used to, but it is crucial to step back. And that's something that I'm committed to do in my work at the coalition and just in my general advocacy. So I just wanted to give you a little roadmap that you can look at. I don't want to go through this whole thing because I've already been talking for a while, but there's beginning steps. Start by doing no harm, listening, not interrupting, learning the language. Then you can step forward to small ways of advocacy. You can invite people of color to speak. Like if you control your neighborhood associations meetings or your sorority alumni association, whatever it is, you can invite people of color to speak, and you have the power to share that pulpit. And then change someone's life significantly. You can mentor and sponsor people of color, you can volunteer in person, or you can make actual changes in your workplace or whatever organization, your church, where you have influence. But I did want to get back to what I said, which was we can't necessarily declare ourselves allies. And in fact, I love this quote from Roxane Gay: Black people do not need allies. We need people to stand up and take on the problems born of oppression as their own without remove or distance. We need people to do this even if they cannot fully understand what it's like to be oppressed for their race or ethnicity, gender, sexuality, ability, class, religion, or other marker of identity. Being an ally doesn't necessarily mean that you 100% understand what it feels like to be oppressed. It means you are taking on the struggle as your own. So we could go on for another 40 minutes talking about allies versus accomplices, or is allyship something good? And you will hear different answers to that. And I do not claim to have the one right answer, but this is something to get you started. And I encourage you to, then continue your education and learn and fall under the leadership of whatever Black person or person of color that you find to be, leading the area that you're interested in, and follow their lead, because what matters in that situation, it's always an interpersonal, not being right when it comes to this kind of work. That's it.
Every week you bring so much, just richness in the knowledge that you're sharing with us, Liz, and it's just, thank you for your effort and your hard work to invest the time to prepare this for us. It can be overwhelming, but I want to encourage people that part of our discipleship as believers is to continue to be students of what God's grace should be like and manifested like in the world. So it can't just stop with me coming to church and doing, being among my own community. I mean, this is part of the Great Commission, that we are called to make disciples, but we are also called to model that discipleship. And so I just want to encourage you that take dosages of this, but yes, be intentional about it as well. One thing that stood out for me, Liz, throughout your presentation is that, part of our discipleship is to experience God's grace in our lives, right? And then as we experience it, we also give it out to the world, and not just our inner world, but everyone. And lately, you and I have had a conversation with a good friend of ours named Gabriel. He also has a similar space, sort of a podcast, and he invited us to speak, individually. And what he asked me in the topic that we touched on during his hour was, what does grace look like in a polarizing time? And as you were sharing with us right now, I think the gesture of listening it's a great component of grace. When we pray and when we're doing our spiritual practices of prayer, part of our human nature is the expectation that God is listening to us, and that we're able to pour out our burdens, we're able to pour out the things that we're carrying, right? Our petitions. It's the same gesture that we can apply as well in our lives to offer to others. So when I talk about experiencing God's grace, if I experience it in my prayer life, then part of my application is to also provide those listening spaces in the real world. And as you just mentioned, sometimes I don't necessarily have to understand somebody else's experience, because sometimes in this case, I can't know what that experience is like. But if I'm leaning in towards the gesture of listening, if I'm listening and I'm providing that space, not only could I learn, but even the long-suffering definition you gave us, then I'm actually putting it in practice, that I am walking with you, that I am willing to pace with you. And I mentioned this last conversation last week. about how there's still an inner child in us. And you and I, both parents, when our daughters are in a bind and they're emotionally in turmoil, we don't immediately dismiss them, and we definitely don't start lecturing them of how they're making me feel uncomfortable because you are crying over something that is really not a big deal. I mean, that's not how we handle, I hope not, as far as our parenting. What we do is we let them express themselves, tell us how they feel, and then we kind of lean in towards either just listening, or then we start the process of letting them know everything's going to be okay. You know, here are a few things that we can do together so you can walk out of this, you know, the situation that's making you feel uncomfortable or that's causing you pain. And there's so much compassion and there's so much patience and grace with our children. If we're God's children, then our sisters and brothers that are from different cultures, different races, you know, the Black community, people of color, they're the children of God. We can't deny that. And so if we really sit in this reflection, we begin to see things differently, that your problem is going to ignite some of my compassion. And not only that, it may cause me pain, especially if the suffering is great, like in this case. What are your thoughts about that?
Thanks for saying that. That's it's really powerful, and I don't know that I have a lot to add, but I do feel that when someone, a Black person or another person of color, has given me the gift of sharing their experience in reality, whether that's a one-on-one conversation or has been willing to open up to a group on a Zoom or in a conference that I've been in.
Correct.
It's so powerful to hear, and I am aware of the defenses that can get triggered, so that then I start to pick apart what they're saying so that I can make myself comfortable again. And I hear what you're saying with our daughters, because a lot of times it can be very triggering when what they're upset about is something they perceive you're not letting them do, or it's something about what they're upset about is making you feel somewhat inadequate as a parent, and that defensiveness triggers anger. And that's something that I have seen happen at some of the anti-racism trainings that I've been to. You hear these things, and everything that I was just talking about, as far as like not all white people and tone policing and everything, sure, somewhat out of our control. And so what I love about the contemplative lifestyle is like we talked about before, the bit of space that it gives you between impulse and the decision of how you're going to respond. And the fact that you can make a U-turn. Like yesterday, I was taking my daughter to get a haircut, and I had an appointment at 2:30, and and I had to be somewhere else at 3, and it was already 2:45, and I wasn't taken in, and I saw someone else go in when we were all supposed to stand outside, be outside in our cars waiting, and I just got so angry, and I go in, and I'm like, what's happening? It's my turn, and I can use that. Of course, the people that are working at this kiddie hair salon are Latinas, probably low income. They're not probably paid very well. I can push my way around in there, and I wanted to. I wanted to tell people how, and I did, though, have the ability to make the choice. That's not the road I'm going to go down. I can see how that's going to go down, and here's the way that I'm going to interact differently. And that's just a gift that I think contemplative has given me in a way that I see. It's not like, oh, I'm a good person, I didn't act like a complete jerk. It's to say, I have jerk in me, for sure, and I have to make decisions too.
What you're saying is so human. And we talked about, even in the presentation, about guilt, and guilt triggers the ego. So instead of providing us a space of grace, we're going to react to defend ourselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think what you're saying is so vital to the difference of an adolescent way of doing a spiritual life or a Christian lifestyle versus a mature way of doing a Christian lifestyle. Because it doesn't make any sense that we do all our Bible studies, all our sermon message, listening to sermons, coming to church, doing, church as a community, but we're still the jerks that's our default or is our first option to react to. It doesn't. It's so contradicting. And I'm not talking about suppressing your emotions or your feelings. They're validated. Your frustration is validated. But at the same time, it's not like what I told my daughter the other day. Is this going to compromise somebody else in a way that can hurt them or put them in a bind? So is it maybe something that I can just sort of sort out on my own, that is not as grandeur as I'm making it out to be in my head? Which brings me to this scripture that I selected for today's topic. In Zechariah chapter 7, verse 9 through 10, it says, "This is what the Lord Almighty said: administer true justice, show mercy and compassion to one another. Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the foreigner or the poor. Do not plot evil against each other." And what you're referring to right now could be a little evil, so to speak. This is an inconvenience, but unfortunately, there's also a rooted, deeper evil out there, where you are wishing something bad on another group because they don't look like you, and even in the cultural differences, as you said, the reactions are different. Being a passionate Mexican male, one of the things that I do when I public speak, I always warn people. I said, if I start speaking Spanish, just follow my hands and you'll know what I'm talking about, right? But what I'm saying is that we're passionate people. And so we do speak with our hands, and our voice intensifies when we're trying to make a point. In family gatherings, it may sound, if you're an outsider, it may sound like you're fighting or arguing, but you're not. And you keep up with different conversations all at the same time. But it's part of this cultural ambiance that we all grew up in, and it's a very natural thing for us, right? So when you're pointing out the differences, that's exactly what it is differences. So nobody, this other way is not better than the other. They're just different. But if I don't allow myself to have a well-roundedness, then I am going to struggle with that. And so I'm going to project my expectation of my behavior, how we do things, and why aren't you doing them the same way? And that's a very individualistic mindset, which backfires, because I stay frustrated and critical and judgmental rather than open and welcoming, right? And so again, I go back to, what is my discernment in front of God? What is my presenting in my prayer time? So is my prayer time only, God, make me a good Christian and let me walk around there and be good to people, or is it, no, authentically show me my blind sides, teach me that this part of me is dark, and I can't continue to react this way in a damaging manner, because that's not a good test. That's not a Christian testimony, right? And it is difficult. This is a very difficult topic. And every week I feel like in our conversations, my dad used to have this saying that when you treated very difficult topics, it had to be surgically careful to do it, right? And that's how I feel. But at the same time, we can't put a Band-Aid to a major wound. We have to go surgically and heal it, and and what have you. And so what you're sharing with us today is it's a genuine invitation for us to consider, am I being authentic about my intention to be an ally to racism, to anti-racism, or like you mentioned, is this about me and my feelings and my emotions and I want it to stop? Right?
Mm-hmm.
And that, and that's just not, that doesn't go anywhere, right? And then again, I go back to the same thing. As adults, we're those of us that are parents, we're modeling for our children. And so our children are going to see this type of behavior, or how are we dealing with these tough topics? Because guess what? Our kids are going to go out, grow up one day, and they're going to go out to the world. And I have seen, especially in my youth ministry, I have seen some heart-aching stories where kids that were, maybe too sheltered came back home and said, why in the heck did you not tell me that the world is ugly?
Mm-hmm.
It was all about princesses and superheroes and everything else, but the world is not like that. And now they spit me out, and here I am back home, and I'm resenting you because you did not warn me,
Mm-hmm.
right? You did not equip me to confront some of these difficult things. And so if, and it goes hand in hand. I mean, would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, I would think, being in the neighborhood where Memorial Drive is located, although I know our listeners can be from anywhere, one thing that can lull you into sort of a false sense of security is if you're at a school that has a lot of ethnic diversity, but it doesn't have any socioeconomic diversity. So you can feel like, well, my child has friends from all races, and that's true. But do they have friends from all walks of life? Do they know what, do they know how to interact with people who don't have the luxuries? I think that one of the major things that's tearing our country apart is the inability for the upper middle class or the wealthy folks to realize that most Americans cannot afford a $300-400 emergency bill.
Correct.
For any emergency expense that comes up. And you think, well, that's just because they're not planning. And if you take time to actually know people who are working paycheck to paycheck, who are the working poor, you'll realize how much planning goes into staying poor. Correct. Simply because you're calculating which bill you can afford to pay this month.
That's correct.
And which one can wait till next.
Sure.
And if you only surround yourself with Black people who are in your profession or in your income bracket, good, great, that's good, but you're still missing out on a key understanding of how the world can be different, experienced differently.
Sure. And having an authentic, compassionate heart does not mean I got to feel guilty about my status. If I'm in a good economic place in my life, that doesn't mean that I have to feel guilty about it. But as a Christian believer, is how am I being a good steward of this established economy? Am I giving a part of me out to those in need? So like even the example you've given about the haircut place. So do I go to a restaurant and they got my order wrong and then create this volcanic reaction, and then on purpose, I won't tip the waiters, or, make sure I put on Yelp that they were horrible to me, causing an effect that, as you just mentioned, to someone that is just trying to make a paycheck for themselves for that day or even that week? Or do I just have the bad experience and still be able to voice it out? But because I have I'm pretty stable in my economy, I still have a generous heart to give a good tip. That's the difference of an adolescent way of reacting or a mature way of reacting. Tied to the allyship concept, there's this book that I've been reading, and I know that you've gotten a chance to also be familiar with it. Joy Unspeakable by Barbara Holmes. She's a wonderful writer and teacher, contemplative teacher. And she talks about in her book about the vocalization, sorry about that, of moaning, the moan. So, you know, in spirituals, in gospels, in Black spirituals, you hear a lot of the and the moaning type of sense. Well, in this book, she writes how back when the slaves were being transferred over and they were in these huge vessels, the Africans that were coming from that continent came from different tribes, so they didn't necessarily speak the same dialect. And so when they were all gathered together in this huge vessel, well, during the night, the boat would rock or what have you, and they would go into the rhythm of the boat and moan. And the way Barbara expresses this is that this moaning was this universal connection of allyship and brotherhood, that they were feeling their suffering together. And what a deep way to identify what we talked about today about allyship. That you defined it earlier about suffering with someone. And I just thought that was so impacting of reading this. The moaning was just this sort of affirmation to one another. I hear you, and therefore you hear my suffering too. That's so powerful. And I think if we were to invite ourselves to an openness like that, and see the suffering that goes on with racism. Hopefully that designed compassion that we already have, because we have God's Spirit within us, ignites us to realize that we need to hear this suffering, right? And we need to hear this despair. And we need to provide the gesture of listening. You know, that's the practice of grace. I mean, that's so powerful.
Yeah, I love that story too. Thank you for sharing it.
Well, any closing thoughts or reflections? This has been such a wonderful presentation. And again, I can't thank you enough how well you prepare those.
Yeah, well, you know, just to go back to the grace that you were talking about, when I spoke to Gabriel, I talked about grace and anti-racism work, especially as a white person, and you have to give yourself grace for the mistakes that you've made in the past. So if there's something that I've said in this presentation that feels like I'm talking about you, I promise you I'm not, and I don't keep tabs on everyone in the world.
Sure.
And you don't need to shut down or feel bad or, you know, anything. It's just the practice of the better every day.
Sure.
So give yourself that grace.
And I want to encourage you, Liz, that if it does land on somebody, and you are that somebody, that it's okay. You don't have to come to me or Liz for accountability. Take it to God's presence. That is the best way to mature. That is the best way to deepen our experience in God. So if it did tug you the wrong way, if it did pull something within you, you know, take it to God and say, why am I resisting? What is it that you're inviting me to listen to? That's a contemplative practice. That's something that in all Bible studies, I attempt to guide people is that whatever you are resisting is really an invitation. Because if you keep running away from it, even in Psychology 101, it's still gonna somehow, you know, come up the surface. So I invite you that if it is stuff that's kind of you're wrestling with or grappling with, take it to God's presence. And if you need more guidance, obviously I'm here as a pastor and to listen and provide you that space as well. But we do encourage you to keep doing the inner work. You know, that's, you know, God's great commission and the invitation he's given us is he sent us out to make disciples, but we definitely have to embody that discipleship ourselves. And that discipleship does include grace, and it's abundant grace, because that's exactly what we receive from God. So I pray that all of you that are listening are invited to that and continue your spiritual practices and continue to listen to wherever God is taking you, wherever God is inviting you. And that this platform has become a place where it just gives you material to reflect on. That's what we pray about. Thanks again, Liz, for being here.
Yeah.
We have some guest speakers for our the fourth. This is our second conversation. We have a third conversation. So I just need to finish my invitation to one of our guests. And when she says yes, if she says yes, we'll have her next week in our third conversation. But for our fourth and fifth conversation, I know I already confused everyone, but that's okay. Our fourth and fifth conversation, we're going to have MDUMC clergy join us again. And so I'm really looking forward to that. So we thank you so much for tuning in. Again, any questions, any comments, you can email me or Liz, or leave them in your in the comments area. And we'll be here to explore along with you all. Thank you, Liz, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you. Okay, bye.
Take care.
We are so glad you joined us for this week's conversation. You're invited to leave any comments or questions in the comments below. I want to leave you with these encouraging words from Jesus from the Sermon of the Mount. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. We'll see you next time.